Good afternoon. Welcome to Speaking Up Together, our virtual town hall to address mental health challenges. I'm Ernabel Demillo. I am the host and reporter for CUNY TV's Asian American Life, a magazine show that has been around for almost 10 years, focusing on the Asian American community, both in New York and the tri-state, and really all over the country. And it is my pleasure to be a part of this panel. And I would like to thank the organizers, Metro Plus Health, for asking me to be a part of this really important topic. I know how it's really challenging for many people, especially Asian American women right now, to talk about our mental health issues. So it's about time that we speak up together. So before we meet our wonderful panelists, community organizers, and local officials, I'd like to toss to a video and to take a look at what's going on with our mental health.
We have to realize that 1 in 5 adults in the US experience some level of depression. And after COVID, these rates have only increased and tripled in the US population.
In the last year and a half or 2 years in the pandemic, and folks getting hospitalized, suicide attempts, overdoses, I think all of those numbers have been 5-fold, 10-fold up.
The stress of the pandemic, we've been in this constant state of being under threat, which is a lot of stress hormones are being released in your body.
Mental health doesn't exist in a silo. All of the external factors, as we have seen laid bare during COVID, we're all connected to this issue. Mental health is physical health. Physical health is mental health.
So before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to introduce Metro Plus Health's President and CEO, Dr. Talia Schwartz. Doctor.
Thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to our panelists for joining us today to continue this important conversation about mental health challenges impacting Asian American New Yorkers, and a warm welcome to our viewers. During the height of the pandemic, we saw a significant increase in mental health needs across the city in every community and every ethnic group, most notably among Asian American and Pacific Islanders, AAPI communities, and especially among women. To gain a deeper understanding of how we could better serve our members, we conducted a survey in April and found that 64% shared that the pandemic has significantly negatively impacted their mental health, compared to 40% of all New York City women. And we are all aware of the increased incidences of horrific violence in our country, with the devastating shooting at an elementary school in Texas yesterday, in our own state, most recently in Buffalo, and in our city. 61% of those surveyed said that the constant reporting of these incidents negatively impacts their mental health. And I think that we're all feeling it, especially today. During the pandemic, women had to be mothers, teachers, caregivers, employees, and much more, which is why access to mental health resources is a must. We must acknowledge that mental health issues need to be part of the conversation, when we're seeing our doctors. Metro Plus Health has over 1,100 behavioral health providers, clinics, facilities across New York City. And our behavioral health services include free and unlimited access to telehealth. We also play a role in identifying members who may present with signs of depression and anxiety, and connect them to the right behavioral health specialist for screening, diagnosis, and ultimately treatment. We work very closely with our local AAPI community partners to address those needs of the group, destigmatize mental health access, and offer services and resources in English, as well as in Chinese, Korean, Bengali, Hindu, and Urdu. Last week, we hosted our press conference on the steps of City Hall to share the survey findings. We are here to continue this conversation about mental health in the AAPI community. Thanks to my team for their hard work and effort in creating opportunities for Metro Plus Health to be a voice for the AAPI community. We stand in solidarity with the AAPI community. And without further ado, let's welcome our panelists and start the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Schwartz. We have put together a great group of panelists, experts on mental health and community leaders. We have today with us Commissioner Manuel Castro with the New York City's Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs. Also with us is Kajuri Chaudhary. She is Deputy Commissioner, New York City Commission on Human Rights. We also have with us Linda Sun. She is the Deputy Chief of Staff for New York State Governor Kathy Hochul. Also with us is City Council member Sandra Ung, representing District 20. She is also on the Governmental Operations Committee, and she is the chair. And we also have with us Joanne Yu, Executive Director of the Asian American Federation. And joining us later in this panel will be Linda Lee, the City Council member for District 23, and she also serves on the Committee on Mental Health, Disabilities, and Addiction. So thank you all for taking the time today to talk about this very important topic. So we're going to start off with some brief introductions. So I'm going to actually start off with Linda Sun, who I know we're not going to see you on camera, right, Linda, who is actually on her way back from Albany, correct, Linda?
Yes, I'm so sorry, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you to the host. Thank you to our moderator for this afternoon. I'm so excited and honored to join all of you to partake in this very important discussion. As the moderator said, I'm the Deputy Chief of Staff to Governor Kathy Hochul. I've had the honor of serving in this role since she took office back in August of last year, and I've had the privilege of working with many of the organizations who are really on the front lines of working with our community as they have had to deal with a very difficult 2 to 3 years ever since the pandemic. So as a community, I think, one, we need to address the stigma of talking about mental health. And then, as the governor has always said, we need to also not just talk, but also do, right? We also need to have action, and we need to bring the resources from the state government to our community, to our nonprofit organizers and service providers, and make sure that our community is getting the help that it needs. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Linda. I'm just going to go, based on who I'm seeing on my grid here. So I'm going to go next to Kajuri. Kajuri, welcome.
Thank you, Ernabel, and thanks so much to Metro Plus for hosting this very critical conversation. Very honored to be in the presence of my fellow panelists as well. My name is Kajuri Chaudhary, and I serve as the Deputy Commissioner for Community Relations Bureau at the City Commission on Human Rights. We are a city agency that educates communities, fosters intergroup relations, and enforces the robust anti-discrimination laws of the city called the New York City Human Rights Law. The essence of the law that says that you cannot be discriminated or treated less well because of who you are, where you come from, how you worship, whom you love, or any other protected categories. I lead the education mandate of our agency, both geographically through our community service centers in all the 5 boroughs, as well as having specialized lead advisors and liaisons to communities so that our agency is representative of what New York looks like. We, for example, have a lead advisor for our Asian communities. Thank you so much for having me on. I am a trained social worker by training, and this is a topic that is very close to my heart. Thanks.
Thank you, Kajuri. Next, we have City Council member Sandra Ung. Sandra, welcome.
Hi, everybody. I'm City Council member Sandra Ong, representing from District 20, which represents Flushing, Murray Hill, Queensboro Hill, and parts of Fresh Meadows. I do represent the largest AAPI City Council district in New York City. I want to thank Metro Health Plus for having this event today. Really honored to join all of you. As a woman, as an Asian American woman, I'm really looking forward to having this conversation. I'll just say one of my biggest priorities, which is something we'll talk about later in the conversation, is about language access. And I think access to mental health resources is like the lack of access to other resources, where you don't have those resources in the language that you speak, in a culturally competent way that you feel you could connect with. That is an obstacle for seeking help. So I really do look forward to having a really productive conversation today.
Thank you, City Council member. Next, we have Joanne Yu, who is with the Asian American Federation. Joanne, always nice to see you.
Hi, thank you for inviting me. Thank you to Metro Plus I'm just excited to be here to see my friends because the panelists are friends. And so we haven't seen each other in a while. Still trying to get a lunch date with Manny now that he's like a fancy commissioner. I don't know if he's having time for his friends, but it'd always be wonderful to be on a panel with Linda, who really has championed so many Asian American issues with the governor's office. I know that it's a frantic time for her. Sandra, and we've been friends forever. And Kadri, we go back to her Sapna days. So, and Ernabel, of course, I get to watch you on, all the great things that you're doing. So it's very exciting to be here to be with friends.
Thank you, Joanne. And then we have Manny, the Commissioner for the New York City Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs. Nice to see you, Commissioner.
Nice to see you as well. And thank you so much to Metro Plus and the organizers of this event, this panel. And of course, it's great to be here with friends, with colleagues, and with elected officials to speak about this really important topic. But I'm also here to listen and to learn from the experiences of these great panelists and see what we can do better in city government to ensure access to mental health services and services in general to our immigrant communities. And so, I'm here again to share what is available but to also to learn more and see how we can work together to ensure our communities are well served. So thank you so much and looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. And so let's get the conversation started. So I'm going to actually start off with the 2022 AAPI survey of mental health among women in New York City. That is the Metro Plus Health's recent survey. And we know that there is really not a lot of data, surrounding Asian and Asian American women specifically in regards to, their mental well-being. So just to have Metro Health Plus put together this survey is already, a big step. We need this data. So according to their survey, Asian women did not have enough awareness or knowledge regarding if they should even seek mental health and where to seek, mental health help. So how do we increase this awareness in our community, among Asian American women, and how do we break down, these stigmas that are really sort of in place for many generations, keeping Asian Americans and specifically Asian American women from seeking, this type of help? So Linda Sun, before you end up in some kind of tunnel of trees, I'm going to have you, start off with that question.
I think, the first thing that you said is that we need to break down the stigma, right? So, and I feel like that comes from making sure that our community, when they're looking for services, they can receive services in their own language and provided by people who understand, their culture, their needs, which is why the governor, and part of her own enacted budget, is creating a workforce pilot. It's called the Mental Health Wellness Community Workforce Pilot. And it's dedicating resources to pilot this wellness program to equip, the community leaders and our nonprofit organizations who are already embedded in the community to have them train new personnel or existing personnel in mental health care so that they're better equipped to engage with the community when there is a limited access to mental health care, right? As part of this year's enacted budget, we're also creating under the Division of Human Rights, this hate and bias prevention unit. So we want to lead efforts around public education and outreach so that they can start to serve as almost like an early warning detection system, right, in our local communities. And so when incidents happen, it's more like a two-pronged process. We can have a rapid response team that can be mobilized into these communities that have been impacted by a hate incident, a bias incident, and they can participate in community meetings for healing and for support, including, many of these rallies that we've seen pop up all over the state They can do trainings such as resolution meetings, public education, referrals, and then we're in the process of creating a state council called the No Hate in Our State Council, and that is going to be led by leadership and local stakeholders organized by various regions, right? So regardless if you're in Rochester versus in New York City, you know that there's a place for you to go to that you trust, that you've known for a number of years, and that you're comfortable having and starting to have some of these conversations.
Thank you, Linda. City Council Member Sandra, you already sort of mentioned this about language accessibility, right? Cultural competency. So we have the resources. So some of these resources are in place, but how do you get the community to know that there are these resources available, especially because so many people suffer in silence?
Right. So I think, in the Asian American community, I think we really just need to, I think Linda said it, talk to our community leaders, talk to our family. Look, I think about growing up and, growing up with my girlfriends, I'm 48 years old. I have never once heard my family member, nor any of my friends ever said, hey, think of that family. If you talk about, oh, that family, someone there has cancer. How sad is that? You should try to help that family. I have never once, 48 years old, heard my family member, any one of my friends, Asian American friends circle said, hey, someone, that family, they're having a mental health issue. Let's try to help them. And that's a problem. Obviously, there are families out there struggling with mental health issues, but we don't talk about it. I think it's time we really have to get to the roots of why don't we talk about it, especially Asian Americans, especially Asian American females. So my thoughts are, Asian American females, sometimes I've heard, oh, she's just being emotional right now. She's just in the mood. She'll snap out of it. I mean, I hear that a lot. Also, I feel that Asian American females, I think the video said it during COVID, we are caretakers. We are known to be caretakers to your immediate family, your spouse, your children, but also caretakers to your parents. That actually adds a lot of stressors, and that's always the case before COVID. But I think once COVID happened, I think those stressors just happen so much more. But people think, hey, we're Asian American women, we are strong. This is what we're supposed to do. We are nurturers, we're caretakers, just basically just plug along and just do it. I think these are the conversations that we really need to have. And, we have to akin it to a physical illness, because we never have. In our community, we never talk about it like that. Like I said, it's really easy to be sympathetic when you say someone has cancer, but never the conversation of needing like mental health, that conversation has never come up. I think that really has to start really with community leaders, with trusted community leaders, and also within families.
Thank you, City Council Member. Joanne, when we met at the press conference last week, we spoke briefly, and you talked about the mental health toll this has taken on your staff, especially the last 2 years, dealing with the lockdown, the pandemic, and then all the violence against Asian Americans. What has your organization done, to address those seeking help, within your organization?
That's a tough question. I was hoping that you'd give me an easy one. But I will say, I also want to echo what Linda and Sandra said. There's tremendous stigma in our community to talk about mental health. Exactly what Sandra said, we can talk about cancer, but we don't talk about depression. And I think part of that is that we need to build a lexicon in our community to talk about some of these things that isn't scary. So nobody thinks, when we talk about mental health, people don't think, oh, that means you're crazy, right? That's not what it is. Sometimes I feel sad. I just need to talk to somebody. I need help. I think we need to have a shared language that destigmatizes what we're feeling. And mental wellness needs to be part of the ongoing healthcare conversation. We also, exactly what Linda said, we need to build a pipeline of professionals. I dropped a link about the Asian American, the op-ed that we released with Dr. Rosa Gill and with Kay Bain about the mental health needs in communities of color, not just in the Asian American community, because we've seen so much violence and tragedy. And we know that over 80% of the mental health professionals are white. If you are an Asian American who you don't speak the language, you're a new immigrant, you're not going to go to a white therapist who can help you to understand what is happening, what you're feeling. As for my community, my staff, including myself, it has been a really tough 2.5 years. We do have healing circles. I think they're all, it's the work is taking a toll. To hear stories from victims who call us and say, "This is what happened to me," or "This is what I'm feeling because it's just not from the victims of hate crimes, but from even nonprofit staff members who say, "I'm scared to go to work," from strangers who contact us to say, "My company wants me to come back, but every time I think about getting on the subway, I have all of this anxiety." And so for all of us, we are trying to create healing circles. We talk to each other. If people need to take a couple hours off to go sit somewhere, if they need to take a day off and go sit outside and get some fresh air, that's what we encourage people to do. But I'll say also that we published the Asian American mental health directory in New York City. And if you type in, I'll drop it in the chat box, but if you type in the language, your neighborhood, it pops up with somebody that you can talk to. And we're getting ready to, there are 100 therapists in there, professionals in there. We're getting ready to drop in the second 100. So that is expanding, and that's a resource that we want to create for our community. But as for my staff and all nonprofit staff, and I will say even the frontline city staff, it has been really challenging. So I hope that having conversations like this to say it's okay to be anxious, it's okay to be depressed, it's okay to ask for help, normalizes what we're all feeling together.
Thank you, Joanne. And speaking of the frontline workers and that pipeline, we do really need to spotlight, the frontline behavioral health providers that are really the true heroes in our community. They are out there on the street, the community, caring for Asian American Pacific Islander folks and in our public health system. And they've brought mental health services into the communities in really their own creative ways. So while working hard to improve mental health in their communities, but also these behavioral health providers are also, like Joanne said, facing their own challenges. And we actually have another video to show you.
It's really hard to find providers of color, providers who are immigrants, providers who kind of look like you, who speak your language. And it's really hard to do a counseling session if you're trying to talk about your trauma and then you're having to go through like a translator or things like that when already you're vulnerable because maybe you are a survivor of domestic violence.
When clients come to us and we mention like, hey, maybe therapy would be good for you, they're immediately worried about what are others going to think of me if I go to therapy? Are they going to think I'm crazy? Stigma is still there and we're working on that.
I think there should be special attention to the mental health of Asian females during this time. Just as someone who's female and who's Asian, we are experiencing something that is potentially life-threatening. Even if you don't label it trauma, you are experiencing something that's traumatic for the community.
Funding is always an issue. That affects the number of programs we can have. That affects how many clinicians we can hire. We've had to close intakes in large part just because of the clinicians. We can't hire new ones without more funding.
For sure, mental health clinicians, there's a huge shortage, but because we are specialized in servicing our community, it's much harder to recruit, attract, and also retain. We're for sure competing against big health systems as far as compensation, salary, flexibility, all of the above. It's been a long and continuous fight.
So we heard, the lack of funding, the lack of resources, the lack of staff. So how do we help our mental health practitioners? And also, we talk about the pipeline. How do we encourage, more students who are pre-health to work in mental health capacity and to help, communities of color, specifically the Asian American community? So I'm going to toss this question to the commissioner.
Well, thank you so much for that question. I really want to highlight a couple of things, but to start with your question, I think that the investment that the city makes in community organizations and providers on the ground are some of the best, if not the best type of investment we can make to address mental health concerns in our communities, especially immigrant communities. Prior to joining the administration, prior to my appointment, I led a community-based organization. We didn't provide mental health services, but we worked with providers in partnership in our communities to make sure that newly arrived immigrants, survivors of human trafficking, and just generally speaking, those impacted by a broken immigration system have the support they need in their communities, in their languages, and frankly, with people who understand what they're going through. So again, I'm a big champion of the investment we've made. I've made a commitment to make sure that all the community organizations that we fund through my office and other offices have the information they need to be able to refer immigrant communities to mental health services. Our office funds many of these organizations that provide immigration legal services. For instance, the city invests somewhere around $63 million in immigration legal services or legal services for immigrant communities. We have to make sure that those providers also have the resources they need to connect people who are struggling with their immigration status or with an immigration issue, those services that they need. I also want to highlight NYC Well, which is a program established by the city for anyone to access mental health services support 24/7 in 200 languages. And I want to make sure that that's available to the community. I do understand that there is more that's needed than telephonic support, which is why we've also set up a hotline at my office at Moya to help individuals who might not be comfortable with calling NYC Health directly and might need that additional support navigating the system or finding other forms of support. And I'll provide the phone number. Our direct hotline number is 212-788-7654. And the NYC Health hotline is 888 NYC Well. And again, these are just two resources that I wanted to share in this space, but of course, much more is needed. And I'm here to work with my colleagues in this panel, and especially those nonprofit providers doing the work on the ground. Again, I really think it's important that we continue to support these agencies, and of course, in partnership with Joanne, we'll continue to advocate for more resources to go to these community groups. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. And if we could have the two phone numbers that you gave out, if we could have the Luna or Nina put those phone numbers in our chat, that would be great for those who have joined us. Kadori, I don't want to leave you out here in the conversation. I mean, because you are out, you had worked at SAPNA, right? So there's the funding. Let's say they get the funding, but then you have to fill the position. So how do we encourage, more Asian Americans or just more people to work in this capacity?
Thank you for the question, and that's like a really critical one. And I'm for a second going to take off my city hat and wear my previous nonprofit hat again, because that, thinking through ways that we can partner with like social work schools, for instance, right? Like I went to Hunter, now the Suburban School of Social Work. So having some sort of a pipeline where students, when they are being trained, can do their internships in these in the nonprofits, and then there is a pipeline to work. So those are definitely some of the ways. Like when I think back on the time that I was at SAPNA and trying to have like more students or other staff to recruit staff members, like that would be a critical, like we would think about like the social work schools and say like, hey, could we be a source of like your internship? Similarly, I think there is still, there is a constant thing about like making sure that programs, that there is a pay equity in these spaces too, right? Like many of our students, very bright, committed AAPI students who want to help, who want to go into the helping professions, are often intimidated because of student loans and other things, are worried about going into the helping professions like social work or counseling and other things. So there is a larger conversation again around health and pay equity in that space too. And just shifting gears and coming back to my city hat, I think as just Commissioner Castro mentioned, making sure that we are working in partnerships with groups here, with the Federation and other spaces, so that city resources and the information that community partners offer can go hand in hand. We are all here to serve New Yorkers. So we need to work together in order to be able to do our best to meet those gaps.
Thank you. And I also think that just for young people to be able to actually see all of you in the positions that you're in, also watching that video, to see folks who are working in this capacity, it gives them too, role models, people, careers that they could aspire to, because we all know, I know this is going to sound like a stereotype, but it's true. It's kind of hard to tell your Asian parents that you want to be a social worker, that you want to work in a nonprofit, right? You almost have to be really brave or change, or don't tell them that you change your major. Joanne, let me ask you too, how, because this is, I'm sure, something that you have to deal with working in a nonprofit, just finding the resources, finding the manpower, right, to encourage people that this is important work. It's important work for our community if it's going to continue to survive and thrive.
Absolutely. The Great Resignation has impacted all of us, right? The entire country. And it is getting harder and harder to recruit people, but it's getting harder. It's getting harder for us because, they need to have language expertise. They need to have cultural expertise. So, those are the things that we're looking for. And I think ultimately it is to figure out a pipeline. We're, as the panelists have said, we're competing with groups that have big money. They can throw money at hiring staff that the nonprofits can't. There is no way for us to compete with them. So we need to think about public service and about how do we and sharing resources. For the Federation, we get a grant from a foundation that we share with Hamilton Madison, Korean Community Services, Arab American Association, and SACNA. They have clinics and they have the capacity. So we are giving them the funding to be able to keep the clinics going. The challenge also is that, as the report said, the need has just skyrocketed. Where you could have a couple weeks of a wait time, now it's just months because everybody wants to talk about what they're feeling. And I think conversations like this is really helpful because, again, we need to normalize how we're feeling and to be able to give people the resources and the tools to be able to address, all their anxieties.
Thank you, Jen. And that's really important because actually, I'm going to get personal here. My daughter asked if she could see a therapist. So we started looking, obviously you have to find someone that is part of your network. Because I know I'm also a college professor and I've talked to some of my students about this, and some of the reasons why they don't seek help is because they say they can't afford it because they're, on Medicare or Medicaid and they're long waits. So, this is actually transition into the next question, like the resources and initiatives, like governmental agencies that have, what can they do to help reduce, these, and that is a pressure, the financial pressure, for Asian women and really, all Asian Americans and all people. So I'm going to ask that question to, we haven't heard from you, City Council member, in a while, City Council member Sandra.
Sure. So one of my initiatives that I really talk about a lot, and I think Commissioner Castro heard about it, I think Joanne heard about it, is really back to the issue of, having city agencies, really be there with the language and the culture that's available. I know a lot of people that come to my office seeking help. And when, their favorite question is when I, say, oh, you could call this number, you could reach out this number. Their question really is there anyone who's going to speak, I don't say Mandarin. I have a lot of Mandarin speakers in my district. And I could tell you if the answer is no, they're not even going to do it. I just know that for a fact. And I get that because I think the video said it's very, especially with something like mental health. I used to work with survivors of domestic violence. I was an attorney for them. You know, it's the same concept. Like, you know, because I look like them, I speak their language. They were able to talk to me rather than someone who didn't look like them, who didn't speak the language. Because you're talking about issues that you cannot really use like a language line to translate. And one of the things I really do want to talk about is to try to move away from using language line as a way to translate, you know, any services we have in New York City. I always felt language line was the last line of resort, not the first line. But over the years, I have seen how, you know, we have now used language line as a way to say, oh yeah, we provide language services, we provide culturally, you know, competent services, we have language line. And that's not an acceptable answer in New York City, especially when I know for a fact we have a lot of bilingual speakers in this city. And moreover, I'll just add one more thing that, you know, I think Joanne said it, like a lot of big organizations have a lot of funding. I think you need to really think about the smaller groups that's on the ground, that's in the community, that actually does work for the community, speak the language of the community. It's time we think about funding for them. And I see that Linda Lee is hopping on. So I'm sure she has more to say about this topic.
Yeah. Thank you, Sandra. So welcome, Linda. Linda Lee is the City Council member representing District 23. She's also on the New York City Council Chair Committee on Mental Health, Disabilities, and Addiction. Thanks so much for joining this panel, Linda. So the question that I had asked were, you know, what are some of the initiatives or resources that governmental agencies, you know, like the City Council have that can help reduce some of the pressures for Asian American women seeking access?
Sure. Just to piggyback off what Sandra, what I joined in the middle, her saying is that there are a lot of, you know, as she mentioned, community groups that are out there providing a lot of these services. And, you know, I have to say, just as an example, I can give you from when I was at my former nonprofit is, so I'm not fluent in Korean, I'll just be very transparent about that, okay? But I remember I was on the phone with, it was myself, the client, our staff who is bilingual, but she's not designated as a translator, so she couldn't speak on behalf of the client. And then you have someone on the state level and language line. So there were like 5 or 6 people on this call. And I just remember, you know, my Korean is not fluent, but I kind of remember hearing the conversation between the language line person and the client. And I was like, I think there's a misunderstanding here that's happening because, you know, even if you speak the language, you don't always necessarily understand a lot of the technical terminology or the nuances of what the issues are that the clients are having. And so I kind of had to intervene and say, I don't think that's really quite what they're saying. But, you know, I mean, to be honest, like it is great that we do have this service that is going to be available, you know, that is available to the city. And I just want to thank, I see Commissioner Castro on here too, as well as Joanne and a bunch of folks. Oh, Karjari also is on here. And I know that the Moya's office, you know, the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, they've been so important in terms of helping out a lot of our nonprofit organizations with this work. And just so you guys know, I know that some of you may have heard, but at least on the mental health side, there will be a rollout of 988, which is going to be sort of like the mental health emergency line, because there's 911 for all other emergencies, and the federal government is rolling out 988. And so I think what we need to do is also make sure that that is part, you know, that we do have the language access and other things that are part of that. I personally think that, you know, what I'm seeing is that, you know, the workforce issues are an issue across the board, no matter what community you're talking about, you know, especially in healthcare and mental health, right? And I think what I'm seeing is that, you know, even if we want to serve our communities, there are very few people who are encouraged to go into these fields and sectors to begin with, right? And so it's not a service that's available now, but I'm hoping what we can do is push legislation, because there is legislation at the state, the Human Services Bill, that would incentivize and provide scholarship opportunities for certain folks in the healthcare sector. What I'm trying to do at the city level is expand that to include mental health professionals, especially ones that have the bilingual language capacity, because I think that's super, super important. And so that's something that I would love to do, is to incentivize people in our communities to go into these fields, because I wasn't told, hey, social work, this is like a thing you can do, or government service or public service, right? And so how do we make sure that we're in these academic institutions as well, and being creating that pipeline? Because I think that's part of the issue that we're seeing on the ground as well.
Thank you, Council Member. Yeah, I think that's really important. It should be like the Peace Corps, where your student loans are paid for, like serving in the military, but a situation like that, so that people will be encouraged, young people will be encouraged, to pursue careers like this. So, one thing that we also haven't discussed is so many in the immigrant community, especially in the Asian American community, our grandmothers, our mothers, our aunts and uncles, they came here fleeing violence, fleeing wars, fleeing dictatorships. And so a lot of Asian Americans are actually growing up in a household where there's already so much internalized mental health issues. So let's talk about that, because what's kind of cool about this panel is that we all come from different parts of Asia, right? This is a nice Pan-Asian group, so nice to see. So I'm going to start off with, let's see, Kajori. Because you've seen that, especially when you were in your social work hat, right?
So intergenerational trauma is a real issue. And again, because of like stigma, because of fact, like, there is a sense of like women particularly are like, there's a sense of like being stoic, right? Like being able to take in the pain and like be the martyrs, if I may use the word. And then, so addressing and breaking the cycle of intergenerational trauma is definitely, again, an important part of the whole thing. And ensuring, again, as similarly to what the other panelists have been saying, the breaking down of that stigma, breaking down of like language issues, breaking down of like making sure that these services are seen as a natural part of everything, right? Like as one would go to a doctor for something else, as Councilmember Ang was referring to with the cancer and the mental health, like that is an interview. That's a very important part. And then having things in ways that our seniors are able to digest, right? Like, so whatever the services we would, having like both culturally competent, but also age specific, like looking at like, what are other non-technology perhaps ways, creating peer groups, like when I, again, referring back to my time there was at the nonprofit, creating peer community health workers who would, get the knowledge and then use that to talk to their peers, because people listen to their peers a lot. So using that model of community health work, as well as creating these communities of practices, would be some of the ways that perhaps we can break that intergenerational trauma.
Thank you. Joanne?
Oh, I'd love to add on to what Kajari said. It's true. I think it's really hard to think about mental health counseling as one-on-one, right? But I think there are ways to do this. I've seen really great models where, after 9/11, I was at Asian Americans for Equality, and there are a lot of Chinatown residents who saw the horrors of 9/11, and they didn't have the words to talk about it. So, it's not to say you all need one-on-one counseling. It's to say, can we get a group together? Can we go out and do something together? Can we go to a museum together? And then can we slowly start to talk about, how are you feeling? I just had some anxiety, I'm not sleeping well. And so we can really do things that are much more community-centered, as our communities are, as immigrant communities tend to be, and to have people lead discussions that pulls the stories out and have people share about like, what are you doing to get over this, right? Sharing resources. And I think those community convenings are really, really critical.
And also, I just mentioned this briefly that, I'm glad that this is a Pan-Asian group of, folks who are part of this panel. And I think there is also just we're not a monolith, right? And so each of our communities have to be treated differently. And I think a lot of folks who are in the halls of, City Hall, but, thanks to the diversity now, it's helping. They don't understand that each of the communities, the myth of the model minority, for instance, but each of these communities have different needs and have different traumas, and that they have to be treated differently, right? And I think that's the other sort of barrier that we're facing as Asian Americans. We're powerful together, but we're also, need to be treated separately, right? Who'd like to expand on that? Got who do we have here? Sandra? You just happened to be on my my grid.
I'm a lot today. So speaking of that, I'll just share my personal family experience as a way of example of Vietnam monolith. So I was born in Cambodia, and my family escaped the genocide in Cambodia. So already that story, and with my mother, right? My mother lost her, legit, like 75% of her family in that genocide, her two sisters, her parents. And, that's the stress, right? That's her history. That's my history, right? And, immigrating in the United States obviously compounds, the stress of being an immigrant and, working hard. Really working 6 days a week, 12 hours a day in this country in a laundromat that has its own set of stressors. So back to what you were saying is that you are right. We can't just say all immigrants that come to this country have the same experience. The background, the history of where they're coming from actually does play a big role in the stressors, in the challenge they face today. So also, so I'm just sharing that as just, an example of what you were just saying. And we do actually have to do a better job of recognizing that. But sometimes I think we talk a lot about the immigrant experience as if it's one immigrant experience. Well, that's not the reality.
Ernabel, if I can jump in, thank you, Sandra, for mentioning that, because the experience of the refugee community, for instance, as Sandra was talking about this, I think about Mekong, right, in the Bronx, and all the great mental health advocacy and work they've been doing. That's a predominantly refugee community. So the trauma that they pass on to the next generation is very real. Don't go outside. What time are you going to be home? That's very real. My family's own history as immigrants who came here in the early 70s. My mom said her trauma was just missing her friends. She said, she never told us this before, but she cried every day for one whole year because she said, what are we doing here? Maybe this was a mistake. But that we didn't know that, right? And so there are all of these communities that are experiencing different types of trauma, different types of loneliness, isolation, and we do need to, as a whole, this is something that is common to all of us, but we are all experiencing based on political situations at home, our economic status here, so many factors, and that gets translated down to the next generation and the generation. So there is so much intergenerational need and trauma in our families.
Thank you, Joanne, for sharing that. And we're actually going to end our panel asking you all to actually share your own personal advice, how you maintain your mental health, along with a closing remark. So I will start off with the last person who came in, Councilmember Linda Lee.
Oh, geez. I don't know. I can be seen as having unhealthy behaviors because I don't sleep enough, which is not good.
Yes.
No, it's interesting because, I talk to people all day. And so I think a lot of people probably think, oh, you must be sick and tired of talking to people. But when it's on a personal level and catching up with my friends, I love breaking bread and just meeting people over a meal. And for me, that's really the way I get more energy is just making sure that I have those connections and contacts with people, which I could totally see why so many people have struggled with the pandemic because everybody was isolated. And so just having that simple coffee break or meal with someone, I think is really therapy for my soul personally. And oddly enough, after I had kids. For some reason, I don't know why, I all of a sudden love doing laundry. It's very like cathartic for me. I don't know why, but I just love doing laundry. So if anyone needs me to do their laundry, I can do that. But it's crazy. So I think for me, it's like finding these weird like things that sort of bring me like sanity, where I can just like shut my brain off for a little bit. But yeah, I mean, I think parting things I would have to say is at least one of the things I'm trying to work on is, and the question that I've been asking myself that you guys sort of alluded to is, you know, how do we respect the mental health sector and the workers and the social workers, me being one of a social worker as well, yay, is like, how do we respect the degrees and the licensing that social workers go through, but also create a space for the non-traditional mental health services that so many of our communities already have built in and that we can encourage and actually get funding for. And I think that's the key piece, right? Is that a lot of this work is what we're doing already, but how do we make sure that it's something that groups can get funding for, because they need to hire staff, they need to pay rent, and they need to do all these things. And just because it's not clinical doesn't mean that it's not helping people's mental health, right? And I think, you know, how do we respect the licensing aspect of things, but also streamline so that it is easier to get people into the pipeline faster, because we desperately need more mental health professionals. And so I think for me personally, that's something that I'm going to really be looking at.
That's great. Thank you so much. Commissioner, what about you? How do you maintain your mental health? Any advice and any closing remarks?
Well, thank you. And again, thank you for allowing me to participate. It's been great to join you and listen to your stories and experiences. I have to say, let me see if I can bring it all together, you know, because I've been listening and one of it's been a roller coaster, first of all, since January when I was appointed. You know, I'm sure my council member, fellow colleagues in the council would understand. But one of the things that I've enjoyed the most about my current role is visiting nonprofit organizations and speaking with people doing the work on the ground and listening to what moves them and what keeps them going, and being able to meet their members and their clients, and just seeing the tremendous work that they do, as hard as it is. You know, I find myself very inspired by what I've seen. Joanne mentioned Hamilton Madison. I just visited them 2 weeks ago. And again, going back to what I said earlier, continuing to support and invest these spaces that are created where people with different experiences can come together and connect is it's so important. You know, of course, we have to invest in everything else we spoke about, but these spaces are unique. We have to continue to support and ensure that they survive, you know, past this crisis. The final thing I'll say is that I grew up undocumented here in New York City, and what changed my life, and really it was a turning point, is being able to meet other young undocumented dreamers. That's how the Dreamer movement came about, just speaking with other folks in similar circumstances. And you can only do that by creating these spaces and creating spaces like here today. And so and with that, folks with those experiences being in the positions to make decisions and positions of power, because they are, and we will recognize, the value that community spaces like these bring. Often those are not measured in any metrics, so I've always encouraged our funders, whether it's in philanthropy and government, to consider that, because we need more spaces like those. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Just all of you sharing your stories, I'm sure also inspires others, right? To share theirs and to also feel comfortable, in these spaces. Linda, are you still there? I know you're still driving, right?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Hi. So any personal advice you could share in closing remarks?
So I feel like we've touched upon this, or many of the panelists have, is that, women are many times the main caretakers in their family, whether it's for their friends, for, their nuclear immediate family, as well as their elderly parents. So I really want to encourage everyone to just sometimes, I think, take a little time for yourself, right? To focus a little bit more on self-care and not worry about what others think. I think just going out for a walk by yourself, right? Grabbing a cup of coffee, getting a manicure, whatever it is. I think we all have to be okay with the fact that sometimes someone just needs to take a little bit more time to focus on themselves, because the healthier and the happier you are, right, I think that then passes on to the immediate people in your environment, in your neighborhood, right, in your immediate circle of family and friends. And I think my ending sort of remarks is that I'm very lucky, I think, to be able to work for a principal, a governor who has invested repeatedly in the AAPI community. She, in this year's budget, put forth another $20 million dedicated specifically to the AAPI community, knowing that our social service providers, our nonprofit organizations have had to really increase capacity because they have had to deal with all of the things that have happened because of the pandemic. And this is a community, I think, that has been suffering even before, New York State went into a formal shutdown back in March of 2020, right? Our elderly have been suffering, our small businesses have been suffering. And then obviously things that, we unfortunately have seen of all of the anti-hate rhetoric, of the xenophobia, and our community having to see these increases in anti-Asian hate crimes, is that there is also, a 10 million pot specifically dedicated to combating and educating and really allowing, I think, our AAPI community to outreach to other minority communities, right? Because yes, our immigrant story is different in many ways, but I think our immigrant story is also very similar in many ways. And so when you add up, all of the communities that have had to deal with hate, right? The African-American community, the Latino community, the Jewish community, the Asian American community, the LGBTQ community, there is definitely more of us than I think there are of the people who are committing a lot of these heinous crimes. So I encourage, I think, our community leaders, our families, our friends to, I think, start to look for more similarities amongst all of us and realize that at the end of the day, we're, one community. And then I think the stronger that we stand together, the more that we can make this, not something that we have to constantly talk about on a daily basis.
Thank you so much, Lyndon. I do want to thank it's Deborah Spence with the New York State Workers' Compensation Board. She actually, in the chat, there's a link to the New York City Office for Aging and expanding their partnership called Get Set Up to offer free senior-specific social engagement and learning platforms with online enrichment classes in different languages. So the link you'll find in the chat. So we have about 2 minutes left. So I'm going to go to Kajoy. Quick advice and quick closing remarks.
Okay, I'll make this quick. Another social worker in the house. So, it's really important that we take self-care into consideration, because self-care and self-soothing are different. End of a day, very stressful day, eating a whole bucket of ice cream may feel like self-care, but it's self-soothing. So making an intentional practice to take care of one's needs, social, emotional, psychological, spiritual, is really important, so that we are not burned out by secondary or vicarious trauma. And as a city agency that's committed to fighting discrimination and bias, because that impacts mental health, I want all of us to remember that the City Commission on Human Rights is your ally. And if you have been treated less well because of who you are in employment, housing, places of public accommodation, please call our info line at 212-416-0197 or call 311 and ask for human rights, and visit our website. And I'll put the information in the chat. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Kaduri. Council Member Sandra Ong.
Sure, I'll make it quick. Two quick things that work for me. One, just start saying no. I know women have a hard time saying no. Just start saying no. If your schedule is too full, you just can't do something. You can't help out that friend. You can't help out that family member. It's okay. Just at that moment, to keep your sanity, if the answer is no, just do that. And also the other thing is, sometimes I turn on my social media for a couple of hours and it feels great. There's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of things going out there. We just talked about beginning a program, and sometimes you just need that mental space for yourself. And so those are my two quick advice. And just lastly, my closing thoughts is that we really do need to have more conversations, such as the conversations we have today. So again, thank you for bringing it together.
Last but not least, Joanne.
So I would just want to give a shout out to Linda. And I'll say that all the circles that I've sat in and one-on-one with the governor, when I say mental health, she's like, I got it, right? And so she's really recognized the need in our community. And I also want to shout out the governor's work on creating access for mental health for all communities of color, because we're all suffering together. So I dropped the daily news op-ed in the text box. What I do, like Linda, I try to get together with people. Nobody believes me when I say, I really am an introvert. I like to come home and close everything down, turn off the lights and just read. That hasn't been available to me for many years now, but I do like to get together with friends and see people. My advice is that we continue to hold these conversations, and we need to continue to talk outside of our own circles, right? And we need to be able to keep spreading and normalizing all of this, to say it's okay to talk about your own anxiety and your own trauma, and to encourage our community to do the same. And I think it's going to be slow going, but I think it is a really critical health crisis that we can work on together.
Thank you so much, Joanne. And I want to thank all the panelists for being a part of this really, really important, talk. It is really all about speaking up together like we all did today. And like our panelists have said, we have to continue this conversation beyond Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. So thank you again. Thank you again to Metro Plus Health and the New York City Health and Hospitals for helping to organize all this. And thank you to Luna for getting us all together to talk about this really very important issue, and to all our attendees. But let's continue this conversation. Thanks so much for joining us.